The Borden Murders, page 98. I have here a warrant for your arrest. Fall River can no longer endure the teasing of the newspapers with their endless clues and hints and theories. For 2 nights, a grim and self-composed Lizzie Borden, the only apparent suspect, had been escorted back to 2nd Street to sleep in her own bed. Packed around the central station, the people rumbled with impatience. A rumor leaked out to the reporters that the inquest was done and Lizzie Borden's arrest imminent, but none of them budged. The public, they seemed to sense, would not tolerate another false alarm. 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6. The inquest had been over nearly 2 hours when Marshal Hilliard and District Attorney Knowlton finally emerged. Without comment, the 2 men ducked into a carriage. The crowd could do nothing but wonder and wait. Perhaps Knowlton had given up after all, headed back on the Boston Trail. The City Hall clock struck 7 before Hilliard and Knowlton returned. Not far behind came Attorney Jennings. The moment had come. Marshal Hilliard entered the matron's room. The supper that had been brought for Lizzie, Emma, and Miss Brigham sat untouched before them. Lizzie had not moved from the lounge where she'd collapsed after her questioning, nor did she rise when State Detective Seaver entered, though there was no mistaking why the men had come. Marshal Hilliard held a paper in his hand. All of them could guess what it was, though only Hilliard knew it was actually the second warrant for Lizzie Borden's arrest, freshly sworn that afternoon. As gently as he could manage, he told Lizzie, "I have a warrant here for your arrest, issued by the judge of the district court." The long-dreaded words struck Emma Borden like a slap. Immediately the tears began to stream down her face. Lizzie said nothing. Her face turned pale, and a sheen of tears glossed her eyes. "I shall read it to you if you desire," and here Hilliard addressed Lawyer Jennings. "But you have the right to waive the reading of it." "Waive the reading," Jennings instructed. Lizzie turned to the marshal. Across her face, one newspaper man reported flashed one of those queer glances which nobody has attempted to describe except by saying that they are part and parcel of Lizzie Borden. "You need not read it," she said. Lizzie Borden was now under arrest. There was no dramatic slapping on of handcuffs, no dragging the struggling prisoner away. Lawyer Jennings spoke a few hopeful words to brace her up, but it was clear to everyone that Lizzie's composure was giving way. She might hold her tongue and her tears in check, but she could no longer force the rest of her body to bear the strain. Lizzie was trembling so pitifully that Marshal Hilliard decided she would not be locked into the cell that had been prepared for her, but put up in the matron's apartment instead. Emma Borden did not kiss her sister, did not even say goodbye. All Emma could do was cry as Miss Bingham and Lawyer Jennings led her downstairs and into the waiting carriage. She did not seem to see the curious throng pushing toward her, nor the police muscling them back. Lizzie was searched, measured, and booked. Formalities complete, Matron Russell took her dazed and silent prisoner by the arm and led Lizzie to her quarters. With no one but the matron left to see her, Lizzie shattered. She sobbed herself sick. Her pent-up emotions unleashed a fit of vomiting, so violent that Matron Russell finally sent for Dr. Bowen. The doctor succeeded only in relieving her physical suffering. Mentally and emotionally exhausted, Lizzie went to bed, while outside her window the newsboys shouted carried the story of her arrest through the streets. Not guilty. It was as if the crowd had never left, never slept. By 8 o'clock the following morning they were back in full force despite a drenching rain. The station doors, which had been barred and guarded for 3 long days, would today be thrown open, and no one wanted to miss their chance to get inside. At 9 o'clock Lizzie Borden would be arraigned before the 2nd District Court. Legal proceedings. Inquest. Has a crime been committed? Inquests are convened in the event of a suspicious death, usually to investigate whether foul play is involved, and, if so, to identify a suspect for arrest. Arraignment. Does the suspect admit or deny it? At an arraignment, a formal accusation against the suspect is read in court, and the suspect must enter a plea. Pleading not guilty moves the case one step closer to trial, while a plea of guilty leads directly to sentencing. Some suspects choose to plead guilty to a lesser offense to avoid the ordeal of trial and make themselves eligible for a less severe sentence. preliminary hearing, also called a probable cause hearing. Is the accusation legitimate? Serious crimes such as murder must be tried before the Supreme Court. But first, the prosecution must demonstrate to a district court judge that there is enough evidence to support the accusation. If the judge decides the accused is probably guilty, the accused is either released on bail or bound over to police custody to await a term before a grand jury of the Supreme Court. Grand jury is the case worthy of a trial. A large panel of 13 to 23 jurors listens to the prosecution's evidence and then votes whether to formally charge or indict the accused with a crime. A majority of at least 12 jurors is required to indict and send the case to trial before the Supreme Court. A second arraignment before the Superior Court often follows this step. Trial. Guilty or not guilty? The prosecution and defense argue both sides of the case before a 12-person jury. The prosecution must prove the accused guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, while the defense is under no obligation to prove anything, nor is the defendant required to testify. The jury votes on whether the accused is guilty or not guilty, and in a murder case, the vote for a guilty verdict must be unanimous, and a sentence is delivered by the judge. For those found guilty of murder in Massachusetts in the 1890s, only one sentence was possible: death. The mood in town had reversed entirely. No longer glancing over their shoulders for fear of the murderer they knew was somewhere among them, the people jostled for a chance to see the woman charged with the most brutal crime in memory, to be in the same room with her and hear her answer guilty or not guilty. They streamed into the upstairs courtroom, filing it so tightly that once again officers were put on guard to turn people away, this time to keep the room from bursting at its seams. At 9:05, the door to the matron's apartment opened and Miss Lizzie Borden appeared on the arm of Reverend Buck, her face flushed and her eyes inflamed. Though her night's sleep, she told the matron, was the best she'd had since the tragedy. She had not eaten, had barely spoken all morning. Emma Borden, Reverend Buck, and Uncle Morse all sat nearby. Yet Lizzie looked straight ahead, as though there were nothing more interesting in the room than the corner of a desk. To some, her unwavering gaze came across as cool and calm. Others thought she bore herself more like one who did not fully understand her position than with the composure of courage. Those who sat nearest noticed Lizzie's lips moving nervously through the proceedings. The clerk of the court called the case the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Lizzie A. Borden on complaint of murder. Here the arraignment took an unexpected turn. Lawyer Jennings, busy with pen and paper at his desk, asked for a moment more. He finished writing, read the document to Lizzie, and she signed it. Your Honor, before the prisoner pleads, she wishes to present the following. Jennings read the document aloud, a motion declaring that Lizzie objected to Judge Blaisdell's presiding over the arraignment, and furthermore that Blaisdell was disqualified to do so. The inquest had not been officially closed, Jennings argued, and if the evidence on the murder was not all in, Blaisdell should not be permitted to hear Marshal Hilliard's accusations against Lizzie. How could Blaisdell remain impartial towards any remaining evidence if he did? This argument might have seemed odd to the spectators, for Lizzie Borden was already under arrest. Clearly, the authorities saw no need for more evidence, but Lawyer Jennings was actually looking beyond the arraignment. His true concern about whether Judge Blaisdell could listen impartially to new evidence had to do with the next inevitable step, the preliminary hearing. At first glance, Jennings' concerns appears misplaced. No matter what happened next, Massachusetts law guaranteed that Judge Blaisdell would never preside over a murder trial against Lizzie Borden. District courts in Massachusetts have jurisdiction over only cases that carry maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. Homicides, then punishable by death, were heard by the Superior Court of Massachusetts. Blaisdell did, however, have the power to decide whether Lizzie's case would proceed to the Superior Court at all. This would happen at this preliminary hearing, a one-sided dress rehearsal for a trial where the prosecution presents its evidence against the accused in hopes of convincing a judge that the case is worthy of a place before the Superior Court. And the catch, the law requires the judge to hear only as much evidence as it takes to persuade them that the defendant is probably guilty. Judge Josiah Blaisdell had already spent 3 days listening to the evidence that had led to Lizzie's arrest. Lawyer Jennings, who had not been permitted into the courtroom during the inquest, did not even know what the evidence was. Was it any wonder that Blaisdell was the last person Lawyer Jennings wanted to preside over Lizzie's preliminary hearing? The way Jennings saw it, Judge Blaisdell should be removed from the case entirely, and the sooner the better. Knowlton stood up. Was this a ploy to delay the prisoner's plea, he wanted to know. Blaisdell said it was not, and ordered the arraignment to continue. The clerk of court, Augustus Leonard, motioned for Lizzie to stand. "This is a complaint charging you with homicide," he called out, and the queer sing-song cadence heard only in courtrooms. "What say you? Are you guilty or not guilty?" "Not guilty," Lizzie said in her low voice. Clerk Leonard, whose age was apparent by his long white beard, had not heard her. "What is your plea, Lizzie Borden?" he sang out again. Lizzie spoke out loud and clear. "Not guilty," she said, her emphasis lost on no one. Lizzie Borden, stand up. Plea or no plea, Lawyer Jennings was not about to give up on his motion. "It is beyond human nature to suppose that Your Honor could have heard all the evidence of the inquest and not be prejudiced against this woman," he told Judge Blaisdell. Blaisdell had already deemed Lizzie guilty enough to arrest. How could he possibly turn around and rule her innocent enough to release after listening to even more evidence against her at a hearing? "The Commonwealth demurs to the plea," Knowlton said in a cool, metallic voice, "and asks that it be overruled. There is nothing extraordinary in these proceedings." He could think of nearly 24 cases involving inquests and arraignments that had been carried out exactly the same way, and no one had protested. Jennings was on his feet now. The difference in this case, he insisted, was apparent and glaring. The Borden inquest had not been convened to root out the most likely culprit. Jennings argued. The police had decided on Lizzie Borden and instead of arresting her, had used the inquest to extract information from her. It had been nothing but a secret trial dressed up as an inquest. Had he known that Marshal Hilliard held a warrant for Lizzie's arrest during the entire length of the inquest, Jennings would have had plenty to say on the score as well. Technically, Knowlton's position was correct. Jennings could not deny that Judge Blaisdell had the authority to convene inquests, issue warrants, and preside over preliminary hearings. Unfortunately for Lizzie Borden, no law specifically prevented the same judge from performing all three roles in the same case. Whether a judge might be biased in such a situation was a matter of opinion, not law, and the decision belonged solely to Judge Blaisdell. "The motion is overruled," Blaisdell announced. "Exception," Jennings demanded. Then, to everyone's surprise, "Your Honor, we are ready for trial." District Attorney Knowlton was caught entirely off guard. "The evidence in this case could not be completed at once," he protested. "It could hardly all be gathered by next week." "We are very anxious to proceed at once," Jennings said. "We ask for a trial at the earliest possible moment." Chagrined, Knowlton had to admit that he was not ready. Judge Blaisdell granted a continuance to the following Monday, allowing Knowlton just 10 days to assemble the evidence in preparation for a preliminary hearing. "Lizzie Borden, stand up," said Clerk Leonard. "By the order of this court, this case is continued until August 22nd, and you are ordered to stand committed without bail." Police held back the crowd as Lizzie Borden, escorted by Reverend Buck, Marshal Hilliard, and State Detective Seaver, stepped into a curtained carriage bound for the depot. 2 more carriages containing 8 reporters took off after her, eager to cover her departure for the county jail at Taunton. Hilliard zigzagged across one block and down another rather than proceeding straight up north, but the tactic only allowed the newspaper men to arrive ahead of them. And then the train was late. Lizzie waited in the carriage while the people outside gossiped and shouldered nearer. At the ticketmaster's announcement of the train's arrival, they surged forward, pressing so close to the carriage door that the police had to intervene yet again. Suddenly the engine bell clanged and Marshal Hilliard pulled open the curtains. It was time to go. For a moment Lizzie's strength deserted her. She swayed and might have tottered, but Reverend Buck and Marshal Hilliard's arms were there to support her. Leaning on the 2 of them, she made her way into the last car and took a seat beside a window. Reverend Buck sat next to her. Marshal Hilliard and Detective Seaver behind. Across the aisle were a pair of newspaper men. Again her blinds were drawn to shield her from the curious. No one spoke. Lizzie stared straight ahead. Word traveled ahead of the locomotive, and curiosity seekers collected at every stop along the 16-mile trip to see the train pass. At Somerset, a gaggle of mill girls waited on the platform when the reporters raised their window to take on the scene. One of the girls spotted Lizzie across the aisle. "Oh, there she is! That's the murderess!" she squealed, and they all crowded closer to get a better look. Lizzie Borden did not flinch. The train pulled into Taunton at 4:20. Hundreds of people choked the platform, swarming so thickly around every car it looked as if the whole town were there. Detective Seaver stepped from the train and went bustling off toward the north end of the station. Fools, the eager throng followed. Reverend Buck and Marshal Hilliard then slipped Lizzie Borden around to the south and into yet another carriage. They halted before a large picturesque building outside the city center. At first glance, it might have passed for a library or a private school with neat flower beds and Boston ivy twining lazily across the two-toned stone walls. But though the windows were tall and ample, they were barred. This was the county jail, Lizzie Borden's home for the next 10 days. Lizzie had apparently steeled herself for this moment. Her step, as she alighted from the carriage at the entrance to the Taunton jail, was firmer than at any time during the journey. The New Bedford Evening Standard noted, with a mixture of admiration and surprise, Marshal Hilliard, still shadowed by the newspapermen, conducted Lizzie to the quarter of women's cells. Here he left her to wait with Reverend Buck for the matron. Matron Wright, the sheriff's wife, turned out to be a kindly woman of late middle years with gold-rimmed spectacles and silvering hair. The more she spoke with Lizzie, the more familiar the young woman seemed. Then the pieces began to fit together. Sheriff Wright had once been city marshal of Fall River. Not only that, the Wrights had been neighbors to one of the city's dozens of Borden families. "Are you not the Lizzie Borden who used to play with my daughter Isabel?" Matron Wright asked. It was so. The avid reporters watched the news sting the matron like a pinprick. Within hours, her tear-rimmed eyes would be in all the papers. Lizzie's childhood connection with the Wrights little mattered when it came to the admittance routine. She was subjected to a bath and a flexible prison rule, and then committed to cell number 3. This was a whitewashed space 9.5 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, just enough for a bed, chair, and washbowl. A large window looked out across the garden. Lizzie had brought a box of books and church weeklies and a valise of clothing. Since she had not been convicted of crime, Lizzie was not required to wear prison dress. All of Miss Borden's weekly newspaper subscriptions would be forwarded here. She did not care to see the dailies and their breathless minute-by-minute accounts of the tragedies. Her meals would be sent in from the city hotel rather than the jail's kitchen, a luxury permitted to any prisoner who could afford it. If the rumors floating about town were correct, if Lizzie Borden had truly committed murder to get her hands on her father's fortune, this is surely not how she planned to spend it.